Live from Quito, Ecuador, I'm Sweeney Gray, and this is from the South, the Midday News Brief from Tell Us Your English. We start this new edition right now. We start with some breaking news from Venezuela. The U.S. Treasury Department has just announced new sanctions against 10 Venezuelan officials and elected leaders. The webpage of the Treasury Department says the 10 include the Minister of Culture, Ernesto Villegas, 3 members of the National Electoral Council, including Socorro Hernandez and Sandra Oblitas, as well as several members of the Constituent Assembly elected in July. Those new sanctions come as Venezuela's National Constituent Assembly, the ANC, approved the constitutional law against hate for peaceful coexistence and tolerance in its latest session in Caracas. The approval of this law comes after dozens of hate crimes related to racial discrimination and political differences were committed in the context of violent protests organized by the Venezuelan opposition between April and July 2017. Our correspondent Reagan Devines joins us now live from Caracas. Hello Reagan, what more do we know about these new sanctions?
Hi, Soina, not too much right now. We're just getting news of it. We're getting news that 10 more persons close to Maduro's administration have been sanctioned, and this includes people from the National Electoral Council, the CNE, persons from the National Constituent Assembly, which does not include the president, interestingly enough, and the Minister of Culture, Ministry of the Office of the President, and it's a range of persons close to President Maduro. And this, of course, follows yesterday's news of the sanctions by the EU, the arms embargo, which prevents any organization, business, company from sending weapons to Venezuela, which they say could be used in repression with the words that they use. And that, of course, followed sanctions by Canada and further sanctions by the US. Of course, Nicolas Maduro himself, the president, has been sanctioned, as well as the vice president. Earlier this year, they were sanctioned by the US administration that has been trying to exert some amount of control over Venezuela following those 4 months of protests. And of course, yesterday, the National Constituent Assembly approved a new law, a law against hate for peaceful coexistence and tolerance. And the National Constituent Assembly plans to sanction very popular members of the MUD coalition, including the opposition National Constituent Assembly head, National Assembly head rather, Julio Borges, Miguel Parasi, Maria Machado, Freddy Guevara. These are all very popular names that the National Constituent Assembly plans to be sanctioned. Remember, the National Constituent Assembly was formed to create peace in Venezuela, to put to rest those devastating months of violence, and to bring justice to those who had encouraged violence by far right-wing activists in Venezuela. And the National Constituent Assembly is doing exactly what it promised it would do. Remember, this National Constituent Assembly is high-ranking. It has more power than the president himself, has more power, and it almost runs right now as the legislative branch of government in a way. However, it has more power than the president, more power than the judiciary, more power than the National Assembly. And so they come together, they decide what is best for Venezuela moving forward, and they approved this law yesterday that is supposed to bring justice to those, to the families of those who were killed. There were 121 persons killed during those 4 months between April and July. 1,958 people injured. There were 917 attacks against businesses, 913 attacks against public institutions, which include schools, medical facilities where there were kids, children's wards. So it was a devastating 4 months of violence in Venezuela that the National Constituent Assembly is trying to bring justice for. And these new sanctions, Soini, don't make things any easier for Venezuela.
Thank you so much for that. That is our correspondent Reagan Devines in Caracas, Venezuela. Cuba has categorically rejected the United States' measures to tighten its economic and financial blockade on the island. The measures came into effect this Thursday. They include further restrictions on travel to Cuba, on conducting business with a number of companies supposedly linked to the Cuban military. The senior Cuban diplomat dealing with U.S. relations called them arbitrary and said they signaled a serious deterioration in relations with Washington.
The measures confirm the serious reversal that has taken place in bilateral relations, starting with and as a result of the decisions adopted by the government of President Donald Trump. These measures imply an increase in the blockage against Cuba and the prohibition on Americans traveling to Cuba, to our country.
Our correspondent in Havana, Laura Prada, has more.
Yes, indeed. Yesterday, after the announcement made by the United States implementing the presidential memorandum President Trump announced in the month of June in the city of Miami, Cuba's response did not wait for long, and Josefina Vidal from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that these measures are a clear rollback in relations between Cuba and United States. Also, that they hide a very subversive background. And these measures, she also said, are unjustified and very politicized, that harms Cuba's economy, both private and state-run. That businessmen from United States will lose opportunities of business to their competition here on the island, and that these measures do not only hurt and damage the people from the both countries, but also other countries and businesses. We must remember that just 1 week ago in United Nations, countries of the world stood by Cuba calling for the end of the U.S. blockade to the island, and also that last week in the Fair of Havana, important business deals were signed with companies from the United States like Caterpillar. These are just some of the answers given to these measures from the Cuba. I get back to you.
Laura Prada there. As U.S. authorities have failed to fully restore basic services in Puerto Rico, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is relocating 3,000 Puerto Rican citizens currently living in shelters to the continental United States. Since the hurricane first hit in September, thousands of people have had to be housed in temporary shelters. Tens of thousands of homes still have no roof, and nearly 60% of the island is without electricity. According to FEMA's authorities, the agency is asking hurricane survivors whether they wish to stay on the island or move temporarily to the states of Florida and New York. But so far, they're finding very few people interested in relocation. Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves, presented the inaugural Excellent Lecture of the Association of Caribbean States. The theme was focused towards developing regional standards of excellence to better prepare for natural disasters and the ravages of climate change. Dr. Gonsalves told the audience that climate change wasn't just making hurricanes larger and stronger, but it was also making it difficult for the people of the region to feed themselves.
Fishermen tell me that they have to dive deeper and longer for conch and lobster, because the conch and the lobster, they're going further down. I talked to them about it, so things. How is this thing affecting us? You come right. We have to dive deeper, creating difficulties. So in simple and in large ways, things which we see and things which we don't see. 6, the ACS has to select particular areas for attention. Training of personnel in all facets of disaster preparedness. Now, training is so important. And knowledge as to what to do.
More news in a minute. Stay with us. Indigenous communities in Colombia confirmed that they will be on alert to make sure that the government fulfills the peace agreements. During a press conference in the Cauca department, representatives from the communities pointed out that even though they didn't accomplish everything on their agenda in this meeting, the process allowed them to strengthen the unity of their movement in the country. However, they were unhappy that Colombian people had to take to the streets so the government would listen to their requests and fundamental rights.
We have reached agreements in education, in land, human rights, indigenous victim protection, and in economy. We would have liked better progress with the agreements, but the agenda was very limited. But I think we have also made significant steps.
Social organizations in Panama are demanding that the state reveals the name of the 63 people that are currently being investigated for receiving bribes to give contracts to the Brazilian construction company Odebrecht. Our correspondent, Hugo Vieira, has the details.
We're here in front of the Panamanian Supreme Court of Justice, where social groups are protesting against impunity in the Odebrecht case. Let's remember that a couple of weeks ago, the Attorney General ordered the investigation suspension, arguing that a lack of time was to blame and that the decision should be made by the Supreme Court of Justice. At the moment, members of different social movements are here because inside there's currently a meeting where they're going to decide if the names of those implicated, roughly around 55 people, included state ministers and relatives of authorities, are going to be made public or not, so that the citizens of Panama can have access to this information about the people who received roughly $60 million in bribes from public funds here in Panama. They're all here waiting for this decision, and the citizens are hoping that those names will come out and don't remain protected. This is what we have here in Panama. Back to you, Soini.
Hugo Vera with that report. Union protests against the Peruvian government of President Pablo Kaczynski are spreading. On Wednesday, nurses at public hospitals held a 24-hour strike, while school administration workers have been on an indefinite strike for the last 20 days. More in this report.
This time, it was the turn of nurses to join the wave of protests against the Peruvian government. They say the budget for 2018 doesn't include wage increases or improvement to the hospitals they work in. This, regardless of the agreement the health ministry signed with their union after talks.
These are talks which haven't produced concrete solutions to the problems, and they keep going without any solution. Our demand is that these agreements be fulfilled and that our problems be solved. And we want to tell the health minister to stop disrespecting the nursing professionals and the population.
This time, the nurses' strike was for 24 hours, but they say that if they don't get a solution to their demands, they will start an indefinite strike for the second time in less than a year. An extreme measure they will take in spite of the union persecution like that against some regional union leaders.
They have us silenced. I've been suspended for 13 months. 2 of my co-workers were fired just because we marched and tell the governor of the inefficiencies and incompetence of those in power, for having shown proof of damaged equipment and poor infrastructure.
Meanwhile, administrative workers in schools and universities have completed 20 days on an indefinite strike. The demand of this sector, which includes over 20,000 workers nationwide, is a wage increase, because what they are paid now is even less than the minimum wage.
The government has taken back everything that we've won in years of struggle. How do you see this attitude from the government? Obviously, we're assuming that the government has no interest in public workers, right?
Given the widespread discontent among public sector workers over the neoliberal policies of President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, in the next few days the General Workers' Confederation of Peru will meet to call for a national general strike.
In Buenos Aires, human rights representatives, trade unionists and legislators marched to the Argentine Congress as part of a protest in the defense of democracy. Protesters marched against what they see as a crackdown on the freedom of the judiciary, institutions and the media by President Mauricio Macri's administration. As well as the protest, the Justice Workers Union has announced a national strike on November 15th against its government and its proposed labor reforms, including reducing the budget for the judicial sector.
The impartiality was lost. Judges are being persecuted. There are ideological persecutions within the judicial power. They want to create vacancies. They want to reduce the public ministry with an office of the executive.
The military operation Amazon Log 2017 continues in the Brazilian municipality of Tabatinga. Our correspondent Adriana Rebreño has the details.
Sí, hola, gracias. Un saludo para ti y para toda la audiencia. Aquí en
Tabatinga, on the triple border between Brazil, Colombia and Peru, the military operation Amazon Log 2017 is taking place. Several military personnel from the three countries and from the United States are participating with 50 soldiers. The main objective of this operation, according to official sources, is to teach military forces how to face humanitarian and natural disasters. Yesterday, the military personnel went to an indigenous community to provide medical aid to around 5,000 people that live there. As for the United States, they have said that they are participating in order to teach what they know regarding humanitarian aid. Although experts have said that the US military is here to get to know the Amazon and build a strategy towards Venezuela after the US President Donald Trump threatened Venezuela with a military intervention. Although experts have said that the US military is actually here to get to know the Amazon and build a strategy towards Venezuela after the US President Donald Trump threatened Venezuela with a military intervention.
Adriana Rebreño. Threats by organized criminals against teachers and students have forced around 300 schools to remain closed for 48 days in some areas of Mexico's Guerrero state, one of the most plagued by drug violence. Local media reported that 59,649 children from preschool, primary and secondary schools have been affected by the suspension, with about an addition of 3,742 teachers and administrative staff. And we'll be back very soon, so stay with us. Citizens from Catalonia were called on to take part in a general strike on Wednesday in protest and to request the freedom of their jailed independence leaders. We have more on the case and the impact of the strike in Barcelona.
It was 12 noon and citizens in favor of Catalonian independence took over the center of Barcelona, something that was repeated across Catalonia. Jordi Sanchez and Jordi Cuixart have been in preventive detention since October the 16th. And the other 8 Catalan ministers have been in jail since November the 2nd. This situation is unacceptable for the pro-independence forces. They say the Catalonian leaders are in jail for political reasons.
We won't trivialize prison. We won't settle with prison. We won't make this an everyday, regular thing.
We are requesting and we are demanding the immediate release. We request and demand the end of the repression immediately. We request and demand the end of the application of Article 155.
The November the 8th strike was called by smaller unions to demand the release of the prisoners, and attendance was less than on other occasions. Nonetheless, a lot of citizens who did go to work stopped for a moment and joined the demonstrations.
It's intolerable that we have a government that we democratically chose in exile and in prison.
Despite the call for the strike, according to the Spanish government, work happened without too many problems.
First thing in the morning, the general report was that there was very little impact from the strike in workplaces.
But even with the modest following from workers, from early in the morning, there were peaceful demonstrations throughout the region. And these demonstrations caused the Spanish authorities to close at least 70 roads, main streets and train lines. In the evening, over 25,000 people took part in the second demonstration of the day. And this is how it ended, in the middle of the so-called Week for Freedom.
U.S. President Donald Trump has signed several commercial agreements with China during his visit to the country, which is part of his tour of the region. Our correspondent Isiara Diaz is in Beijing with this report.
Trump celebrated his first year in office with the signing of several bilateral agreements that reached $2.5 billion. This comes after Donald Trump criticized China's commercial exchange policies and accused the nation of stealing jobs from Americans. These agreements were signed after both presidents took part in a business forum. The trades focused on the energy, automobile, and aeronautical industries. One of the most important agreements will take 3 Chinese companies to Alaska for gas extraction, a $43 million agreement. Xi Jinping asked Donald Trump to allow a bigger tech trade between both nations so that China can invest more in the U.S. territory. He also highlighted the improvement in the relationship of both countries. The Chinese president also said that the cooperation is the only way that China and the United States can enter into a dialogue. The U.S. president also praised Xi Jinping during his speech and suggested that China has the opportunity to resolve the tensions happening in North Korea Peninsula and asked Xi Jinping to pressure North Korea to abandon its nuclear program, even though China is one of North Korea's main allies. Xi Jinping said that he's committed to bring peace to the region and to open to dialogue. Donald Trump will be in China until tomorrow.
And now we'll take a look at the other news making headlines around the world.
Delhi's smog problem is worsening day by day, with health warnings and urgent recommendations by the government coming in thick and fast. Toxic levels have hit the highest danger level possible on the government's existing rating system, with readings at 600 on a scale where 100 is deemed unhealthy. The causes are a toxic mix of smoke and fumes from burning vegetation, vehicle fumes, and construction work.
So it will lead to more chances of breathing difficulty, cough, chest tightness. People with underlying asthma will have worsening of symptoms and they will need to take more medication. People with heart failure or heart problem will have worsening of their heart disease, and there will be an increase in number of people coming to emergency with respiratory failure because of high levels of pollution.
An all-women protest against U.S. imperialist policy took place in Manila ahead of President Trump's visit to the Philippines as part of the ASEAN summit. The protesters denounced the role of the U.S. in exacerbating the wage gap, as well as its policy of exploitation of less powerful nations. Activists from the Mindanao minority and other Southeast Asian nations attended the rally.
And for him to be sitting at the head of one of the most powerful countries in the world, he has used that to advance every corporate agenda that he possibly can in every other country in the world.
Haiti has been ranked the worst country in the world to be affected by extreme weather in 2016, according to a German Watch report. Haiti was hit by its strongest hurricane in 50 years last year, just 6 years after it suffered a devastating earthquake. 9 of the 10 nations which were worst affected, according to the report, were developing countries, with Honduras, Haiti and Myanmar as the hardest hit, according to the newly published index.
It shows that the 3 most affected countries were Haiti, Zimbabwe and Fiji. What you can also see on this table is that we had some extremes last year, and this is, for example, reflected in the very high percentage of losses that affected the GDP of Fiji and Haiti. But also we see that in India there were more than 2,000 people killed as a direct result of extreme weather events. These are quite extremes in this data, and with the US we can see that also industrialized countries belong to the 10 most affected countries in 2016.
Saudi Arabia continues the blockade on Yemen, and according to UN officials, it could lead the nation towards the worst famine in decades. Our correspondent Oscar Ipelde has more details.
The Saudi Arabia blockade is rising the lives of millions in Yemen. The United Nations has alerted that Yemen is facing the worst famine in decades, and the consequences could be catastrophic if the blockade continues. That includes the lack of humanitarian supplies. On Monday, Saudi Arabia decided to close every port, ground and air access to Yemen. This after the Houthi rebels targeted Riyadh with a ballistic missile. Saudi Arabia wants to prevent Iran from giving weapons to the Houthi rebels, although Iran has denied these facts. The UN humanitarian chief has asked Saudi Arabia to lift the blockade on Yemen to prevent the worst famine seen around the world in the last decade, a situation that could risk the life of 7 million people. The Red Cross International Committee announced that they were unable to send a chlorine shipment essential to fight the cholera epidemic that is ravaging the country. More than 900,000 people are affected by cholera in Yemen. The Saudi Arabia coalition has intervened in Yemen's civil war from 2015. In the last few months, attacks have intensified in Aden, where the Yemeni government is located right now. In the last 2 years, more than 8,500 people have died as a consequence of the air and land attacks. More than 60% were civilians. Back to you, Soyini.
Oscar Ipelde with that report. And Palestine is getting ready to commemorate the anniversary of Yasser Arafat's death on November 11th. Our correspondent in Gaza, Noor Harazin, has the details.
We are 2 days away from the 13th anniversary of the death of the Palestinian icon, the Palestinian president Yasser Arafat Abu Ammar. Palestinians here in the Gaza Strip in the West Bank and also in the Palestinian occupied city are getting ready to commemorate this occasion. Many Palestinians do believe that Yasser Arafat was assassinated by Israel by poisoning him, and they do believe this until now, even though that the investigations has stopped.
No Harazin there in the Gaza, and we've come to the end of this midday news brief. So for these and many other stories, you can find them on our website, telesiotv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for Telesio English. I'm Soyini Gray. Thank you so much for watching.
The evidence is well organized. It reveals the stratagems that the power uses to control the system. Both resistance and dissidents condemn the crimes committed to achieve some whims. The basis of evidence the journalist Chris Edge exposes. Days of Revolt. Thursdays. Only on Telesur. In a world infested by inequalities, abuse of power, and injustice, the American journalist Abby Martin covers the struggle for fundamental rights worldwide, deepening into the search of files which uncover the empire's strategies through our screen and web platform in English. The Empire Files with Abby Martin. Tuesday, only on Telesur.